Hi to everybody. Indeed, it's not a feedback, a classical feedback, let's say. But to introduce this session, I thought that it would be interesting to try to understand the controversy occupying our minds and activities daily. So this controversy for the dismantlement of wells of water mills. And I will leave aside the big dismantlement of dams. The object is the water mill, which is more than a machine. Anthropologists were talking about the mother of machines. As you know, with the rivers, we also have territorial milestones, so we can separate spaces of the river with limitations in the Middle Age and even later. So we can talk about fish spaces, for example. So this object, I insist on that point to give you an idea of my approach. So the idea is to go further than aware as a transversal obstacle and to talk about the place, which is the water mill. The objective of this presentation is to deconstruct this controversy in order to understand it better. Before explaining the conflict and associated to the Water Framework Directive, I'd like to show you that we can interpret things differently and explain more in depth the origin of this controversy and its evolution. The idea is to have an overview of the evolution of the different species and to see the continuity and adjustments which are progressive. And the last element of my presentation, I'd like to explain the structure and the dynamics of the arguments. For those in favor and those against dismantlement, we cannot separate these actors of the controversy on two sides. So how did I do to get these data? I used scientific literature and archives, so reports, ancient reports or recent reports, specialized press, associations, blogs, and I also used a new source for me, maybe not for you. So it is the one of questions and debates in the parliament. We use in social sciences this source more and more. So I used it for my work. So first step, I'd like to explain the archaeology of the environmental controversy before explaining the recent situation. I think it is useful to remind you that the where can be good or bad, and it is this articulation between advantages and troubles which is marking the debates during the Middle Age. After the Revolution, we have got a liberalization of wells, dams. They can be bought freely, and it's not codified by the former regime codes. Moreover, we have got an industrialization which is growing. As of 1820, and it is linked with industrial transformation. Wells of the mills are very important. So physiocrats who want to develop the soils and they are not well managed and they accuse them of generating floods and also bad conditions with diseases. So at the beginning of the 19th, the soils are not well seen. But later on, as you know, the 19th century is the golden age for the use of water. I think that you are used of administrative archives, as you can see on the screen at the moment. As you know, we produced knowledge and a will to regulate and maintain a balance thanks to the intervention of the administration. If you have got a lot of documents, water regulations, which are still used today, I'd like to highlight that the mission of the administration at that time was fragile because the sharing between public-private role was not well defined. The status of the streams was unstable, and the mission of the administration was only to ensure the free movement of waters and to avoid major water issues. In this context, we have got a lot of writings by engineers, especially from Benjamin Nadeau de Buffon, who created the hydraulic service in the middle of the 19th century. He wrote, there is between a river, a natural river, and a river with dams, a difference between the raw nature and cultivated nature. It is the same thing between a tree, a wild tree, and another one with fruits. So this was a doctrine at that time. Second argument on which I wanted to insist in this archaeology of controversy, so the circulation of traveling fish. I wanted to come back on this fact. So before the devices of civil engineering, we had a lot of techniques on each side of the Atlantic, but also in Asia. So it was to facilitate fishing and also to maintain the resource. So with different fish lobes in New England, for example, I think that Colin knows these techniques. So different techniques to facilitate migration of fish on whales. In 1830, we implement the first systems in England, in the Dinston distillery on the Thames River, and also in the New Brunswick, we try to implement this new type of infrastructure. And on the picture on the left, you have got the model of a fish path of Ballister in Ireland. The first aspect, to take into consideration the difficulty for fish to cross these whales. So which other solution could we envision? In France, we talked about removing whales, useless whales, since the beginning. After a few years after implementing the first fish passes in 1856, in an utilitarian perspective, proposed to remove useless wells, to have aquacultures, and to monitor these waters. Because at that time, we have got a growing influence with the repopulation of waters. And later on, after the law on hydraulic energy and its instructions in 1927 and 1928, we implement the regime of reserved rivers. Only 20 fish scales are implemented in France, and 1/4 are useful. An efficiency which is quite relative in the end. Second point of this archaeology, it is the time of transformation for these mills. So as you can see on the graph, you can see a peak at the beginning of the 19th century and then a decline, even during the industrial era. With this abandonment, we have got a lot of transformation as well in farms, different infrastructures. At the beginning of the 19th century, we have got a new project. It is called Houille Verte, in contrast with Houille Blanche, proposed by the engineer Bresson, and he wants to try this idea in Normandy, Anjou, Brittany in France. So a few experiences in these regions. In the middle of the 19th century, geographers studying these sites of industrial geography, they see that it doesn't work. So Mr. Saw in 1944 is saying that from these ancient kinds of use of the hydraulic power, we don't have much left. So we can see the literary approach of the geographers at that time. So we have got a distanced view on these obstacles. And with that, we will have the emergence of patrimonial values. In the 1960s, we will see new associations implemented. What's happening from the 1960s and 1970s? So what do we hear in parliamentary debates about wells? So the first point, it is the marginal economical dimension. Sampling, so a fee for the mills which are still in use. They are not well maintained, and locally speaking, we can mobilize ourselves to remove hydraulic wells. In the 1960s, we had an association which wanted to remove different dams. So you know the history, so development of hydropower. We have got new dams like in Vichy, and also implementation of the Salmon Plan with a new migration policy, restoration of migratory axis. In the same time, an important support to small hydraulic power. This articulation very difficult between all that. Give origin to an implementation of a tension between producers, administration, fishermen, and environment activists. The owners want to use energy, and they are obliged to equip their wells sometimes. As of 1987, it is the second time of controversy. The question of equipment for wells and the troubles for the administration are registered in the specialized press. as you can see here, an editorial from an association, but also against attacks from part of the administration, from diverse interests, but it's not the good target. So free movement, private, public ownership, and in the end, they were accused of hindering the salmons to ascend the rivers. I'll be finishing. I think my time is over. So to conclude, I'd like to tell you what we can observe in the controversy. So with all the text that strengthens legitimacy of restoration, ecological restoration of rivers. So some arguments used by the people mobilizing themselves against these projects and the removal of dams, it is stable in time. So I've identified 6 pools. So the first one, defending the rights. The second one is linked to the links between the mill and its environment, so a controversy within the controversy about the impact of water mills. There is also a question linked to cost for ecological restoration. We also have elements linked to heritage, economic aspects, and the last point, a panel of arguments about the implementation of ecological restoration. I cannot give you a thin analysis. I've written it. Some articles will be published on that. I can answer to your questions. But what I want to say is that often these points are not treated. So we leave them aside. They are neglected. And we have got a very limited argumentation from part of the opponents or from the people criticizing the projects of ecological restoration. But I think that some aspects, it would be good to analyze them more in depth and explain how we do with integrated management. So I think that the controversy at the moment, it shows the limitations of integrated management. So it is difficult to involve the users. You need skills for that. But you also need a will to involve the users and to take time, and sometimes it's not possible for managers who have other constraints, so regulatory constraints or with objectives, deadlines. I'm not here to give you solutions like that, but I think that the analysis of the history of that controversy can help us as well to understand better some positions and also to overcome oppositions which are too limiting.